I'm testing a watercolor stock I've got quite high expectations for. It's the Saunders Waterford 300-pound cold press high white. You can see it's got a much more subtle grain texture, though not at all mechanical, nice and random compared to other cold presses. We're using the New Zealand Silver Eye as a test subject once again, just tracing it through on the light box. Again, just the barest outline details. The paper, when I'm working on it, feels a little bit drier, and it is. You can see the first loaded brush went down almost as if it had a dry brush technique. So clearly it's a very thirsty stock. I'm going to have to load the brushes with a lot more water and a lot more paint. Can be a concern on large format prints because you go through quite a lot of paint as it is, and this will likely use at least double the amount of watercolor I would use on a stock like Arch, for example, which is more highly sized on the surface. The concerns with the very thirsty papers are that if the paint dries before you work it in, it can often have a tendency to stain, so I'll be checking for that. Dropping in some panes in phthalo green, give it a more blue-green background to offset the olive of the bird. Now that I'm using more loaded, wetter brushes, the paper's responding a little bit more politely. Now I'm sort of pushing the envelope as far as water and paint goes, but it's able to be reworked. So there's promise in this stock yet. I'm just going to do a satin over paint, not quite a glaze because I'm not letting the bottom layer dry. And it seems to work in reasonably politely. Wet on wet, if you can manage to put paint on in the 5 seconds before the paper dries, bleeds very softly. And it seems, remarkably enough, as if blooms are showing a bit of definition, which is a surprise on an absorptive stock like this. I would have expected them to disappear to nothing. The pigment is not bleeding into adjoining colours quite as exquisitely as in some of the other stocks like the Lanaquarelle and Heritage and the Hahnemüle. Secondary blooms also maintaining a little bit of definition in their cauliflower outlines, and I'm able to work with the paint on the paper, adjust its intensity with water and more paint without too much trouble at all. So it does have some absorptive dry qualities, but it's not prohibitive to work on, and I'm quite liking the effect as the paint dries. The colour intensity is, I think, above average. A lot of these rough and cold pressed to 300-pound stocks, they tend to suck in the paint, which doesn't let the translucent layers of the paper illuminate it, and the pigment gets lost and faded a bit. It's not fading too much, so that's another plus column. Again, pretty easy to work in over-painted shadow areas. Let's see if the edges can soften. Not too bad. I'm just painting some rippled reflections off camera. It's a common tactic of mine. The beak detailing went quite nicely on this example, and now I'm just dropping in more Payne's grey over the phthalo, which gives it a slightly lilac cast. And you know, it's glazing extremely well. No pilling, no picking up, muddying colours underneath. Typically it either glazes or lifts and blooms, but this paper seems to do both. And there's our finished bird. A fantastic stock. Paper had dried. I did an extra swatch test of some warmer hued broad background washes with blooms. For an absorptive stock, it actually bloomed quite nicely. It does feather off without a lot of definition, but the basic texture is captured. So, I mean, the stock does have promise. Seems to be coming down to Waterford or Lanaquarelle. The definition of the blooms was a concern with Waterford, so I waited a little bit longer until the paint was only set and dry, and I did get some defined blooms. And also, this is just the world's best glazing paper, as you can see from these trees that I've overglazed over the wash. Leaves the underlying paint, doesn't muddy, doesn't pill at all, and I was able to get some very, very delicate, tiny glazes with a lot of control, many multiple layers, and it even lifted. So all in all, I think it's my number one stock.